Have you ever noticed how some thoughts seem to come back again and again, even when you try to ignore them? That silent voice that accuses, that remembers mistakes, that creates fear for no apparent reason, as if something is happening inside you all the time. What if this battle was not only emotional, but spiritual? What if what you call anxiety, confusion, or tiredness were actually an invisible field where eternal decisions are being shaped? There is a point where time seems to slow down, where the mind gets stuck in cycles, repeating scenarios, anticipating pain, reliving failures, as if there was no way out. You try to distract, you try to pray, you try to forget, but something is still there, insistent, like an echo that won't be silenced. Now imagine that there is something hidden in the midst of all this, something simple but powerful, so close that it goes unnoticed. An ancient principle revealed in Scripture, taught by Jesus, but rarely understood in its depth. A spiritual key that does not depend on human effort, but on inner alignment. Something that can interrupt this mental cycle and bring a peace that cannot be explained, only experienced. It's not theory, it's not motivation, it's not something superficial. It's profound, direct, and transformative. There is a way to clear the mind, but it is not obvious. It is hidden in words that many have read, but few have actually lived, like a spiritual code that needs to be activated. And today, something begins to change. Not because everything around you will disappear, but because inside you, something can be rearranged. If you stay, if you listen to the end, there is a silent promise. Your mind can find rest even today. Romans 12:2 says, "And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God." This transformation does not begin outside, it begins within, in the place where few look. There are thoughts that need to be confronted, others that need to be silenced, and some that need to be replaced with the truth. What you feed grows, what you accept governs, and what you believe in defines the course of your life. There is a way to take this spiritual control without weight, without guilt, without confusion, but with clarity, firmness, and direction. And all of this will be revealed in a simple but profound way, as it has always been before your eyes, but never fully perceived, because it starts now. And that's exactly what begins to reveal itself now. Because along this journey, you will realize how God treats what no one sees. Hidden thoughts, memories that still hurt, silent accusations that weigh without anyone noticing, and distractions that take you away from peace without making a sound. Each part will open your eyes to simple but profound principles that can align your mind with God's voice and bring clarity where confusion exists today. You will recognize real stories of people who faced intense internal wars, but won when they allowed God to transform their way of thinking. And as you continue, something begins to happen inside you, as if every word is finding exactly the right place in your life. God knew you would be here, and maybe this is the time for you to also become an instrument, leaving your like, subscribing, and allowing this message to reach other lives that also need this transformation. There is a place where almost no one looks, but that's where it all begins. Before any wrong decision, before any visible fall, something happens quietly within the mind. It was like this from the beginning. In the garden, it wasn't the action that came first. It was a thought, a subtle suggestion, almost imperceptible but loaded with distortion. Is this how God said? This question was not just curiosity, it was a seed. And this is exactly how many battles begin even today, with ideas that seem small, but that carry an invisible weight capable of altering entire destinies. The mind becomes a battlefield when it begins to accept thoughts without discerning their source. Not everything you think comes from you, and not everything that seems true really is. There is a silent strategy that tries to confuse, invert, distort. What was once clear is beginning to look doubtful. What God has said begins to seem distant, and without realizing it, the mind moves away from the truth, not abruptly, but slowly, as if getting lost without noticing the way. The most dangerous thing is not visible error, but thought accepted in silence. Because when the mind is contaminated, decisions only follow what has already been built inside. That is why God from the beginning already pointed to the need for vigilance, not only about attitudes, but about thoughts. A mind without a spiritual filter becomes vulnerable, but a mind aligned with God becomes protected. And perhaps now you will begin to realize that many of the struggles you face did not begin outside. They began within. Ideas that have emerged, doubts that have grown, fears that have settled in without asking permission. And the more these thoughts are fed, the stronger they become, creating cycles that are difficult to break. But there is a key here that changes everything. Perceiving is already the beginning of liberation, because when you identify that there is a battle going on in your mind, you stop being just someone reacting and become someone watchful. And it is at this moment that God begins to teach something profound, that clearing the mind is not about fighting hard, but about discerning clearly. Not every thought deserves space, nor does every voice deserve attention. If this message from God is speaking to you in a special way, perhaps it is because today was the right day for you to see it more clearly. Don't ignore this touch on your heart. If something inside you has awakened, write in the comments, Amen. Sometimes a simple answer already marks the beginning of a transformation that starts from the inside out. There is something that many have not yet realized, but that completely changes the way you live. The quality of your mind is defined by the voices you decide to listen to. It's not just external words, but internal thoughts that arise, repeat, and begin to influence your emotions, your decisions, and even your faith. And here's a sore point, because not every voice that echoes within you comes from God. Some confuse, others accuse, others rush, and many seem so natural that they go unnoticed. It was like that with Samuel. As a young man, he heard a voice calling, but he didn't recognize where it was coming from. He would get up, run, try to understand, until he realized that he was facing something bigger. This reveals a profound detail. God's voice is not automatically recognized. It needs to be discerned. And this discernment is not born of chance. It is born of a mind that is being spiritually trained. Because while the mind does not learn to distinguish, it mixes everything. Thoughts of fear with divine direction, anxiety with spiritual urgency, doubt with prudence. How many times have you felt something inside you and wondered if it was God or just your own concern? How many decisions have been blocked because there were too many voices at the same time? This is not a coincidence. This is mental confusion. And God does not work in confusion. His voice brings clarity, direction, and peace, even when challenging. Other voices, on the other hand, generate heaviness, haste, and restlessness. Speak, Lord, for your servant hears. This phrase is not just an answer, it is a posture. It is the moment when the mind is silent so that God speaks. And perhaps that's exactly what's missing today. Less internal noise and more room for the right voice. Because while everything speaks at the same time, nothing is understood in depth. God does not compete with noise. He reveals himself in attention. And mind clearing begins when you decide to filter out what comes in and what remains. Not every thought deserves to be fed, nor does every idea deserve to grow inside you. There is an urgent need to learn to stop, observe, and ask, does this voice bring me closer to God, or does it take me away from him? And the more you practice this, the more sensitive you become. What was once confusing begins to lose strength. What he once dominated begins to be identified. And little by little, your mind ceases to be a place of confusion and becomes a space of direction. If this word is awakening in you a sincere desire to hear God more clearly, comment right now, "Speak, Lord, thy servant heareth." Write as a true prayer, as someone who has decided to make room for the right voice. And if this made sense to you, leave your like, because this message can reach other people who are also trying to understand what they are hearing inside themselves. There is a type of tiredness that does not appear in the body, but weighs on the mind. It's that silent exhaustion that accumulates little by little to the point where even those who have always been strong begin to feel that they can no longer continue. And maybe you know that feeling, when thoughts start to get heavier than they should, when the mood slows down without clear explanation, and everything seems harder than before. This is exactly what happened to Elijah. After experiencing one of the most powerful moments of his spiritual life, he found himself overwhelmed by a thought that didn't seem to match everything he had ever experienced. "Enough, take now, O Lord, my soul." Notice this carefully, because here is an important secret. Even a mind that has already experienced miracles can become vulnerable when it is tired. The problem didn't start outside, it started inside. A thought gained space, grew, and suddenly everything lost its meaning. This shows that it's not just circumstances that define how you feel, but how your mind is being affected by them. And perhaps the most profound thing about this story is not Elijah's despair, but the way God responds to it. God does not correct him harshly, does not accuse him, does not abandon him. God cares. He allows Elijah to rest, feeds his body, and only then begins to treat his mind. This reveals something powerful. Mind cleansing doesn't happen with pressure, but with care. God understands the process. He knows that there are thoughts that are not the result of rebellion, but of exhaustion. How many times do negative thoughts appear not because you've lost faith, but because you're too tired to hold on to what you believe? And in those moments, the mind begins to distort reality, turning small situations into big weights. What once seemed bearable now seems unbearable. And if this is not addressed, these thoughts take deep root. God is not ignorant of this. He enters exactly those places where the mind is weakened. He restores with patience, rebuilds with love, and strengthens little by little. Because a healed mind is not born of strength, it is born of constant care. And maybe today you don't need more charging, but restoration. If at any time you have ever felt this way, overwhelmed inside, perhaps this is a simple but important moment. Without haste, without obligation, just as a sincere expression, write in the comments, "God is watching over me." Sometimes recognizing this already begins to lighten the weight that no one else sees, but that God has always seen. There is a silent mistake that many people make when talking about transformation, believing that clearing the mind is a one-time thing. As if it were a moment, a prayer, an intense experience, and everything would be solved. But God has never worked like this. From the desert, he already taught a principle that many have not yet realized. When the people needed food, he did not send provision for months or weeks. He sent the manna every day. "Behold, I will rain down bread from heaven for you." This wasn't just about physical sustenance, it was a profound spiritual lesson. The mind also needs to be fed daily. Thoughts do not automatically stay clean. If there is no constant renewal, what was cleaned yesterday can be contaminated today, and perhaps now you will begin to understand why, even after strong moments with God, some old thoughts still try to come back. It's not because nothing happened, but because the process needs to continue. The human mind is influenced all the time, from what you see, from what you hear, from what you remember. And if there is no conscious decision to feed the interior with what comes from God, other things will occupy that space. It is like a piece of land that, if it is not cared for, begins to be taken over by what has not been planted. Therefore, renewal is not an isolated spiritual event. It is a daily, simple, constant, and profoundly transforming practice. The manna could not be accumulated. When someone tried to save it for the next day, it would spoil. This reveals something strong. You don't live today with the strength of yesterday. There is a new food available for each day, a new direction, a new grace, a word that arrives exactly as you need. And when the mind feeds on that, it stays aligned, empowered, and protected. Perhaps what is missing is not more effort, but constancy. Small moments with God, repeated daily, have the power to reorganize thoughts that seemed impossible to control. Gradually, the mind begins to change. What you once dominated loses strength. What seemed confusing begins to be clarified. And without realizing it, you start living differently, not because everything around you has changed, but because inside you there is a new pattern being built day after day. A renewed mind is not born from a single encounter, but from an ongoing walk with God, where each day carries its own portion of peace, direction, and clarity. If you are here so far, it is because something within you recognizes that this change is possible. God is speaking in a personal way, dealing with areas that perhaps no one else sees. And at the end of this path, there is a moment prepared especially for you, a prayer that can mark a new beginning in your life. Therefore, stay until the end, because what is being built now within you will reveal itself in a deeper way. There is a silent principle that governs anyone's life, even if they don't realize it. That which occupies the mind begins, little by little, to shape destiny. It is not something immediate, it is not visible from one day to the next, but it is constant. Thoughts are seeds, and every seed, when cultivated, produces a result. That is why the word warns so strongly, above all that must be guarded, guard your heart, for out of it come the springs of life. This is not just advice, it is urgent direction. The mind is not neutral, she is always producing something. When thoughts of fear, doubt, and discouragement find space, they begin to influence decisions, reactions, and even the way you see yourself. And without realizing it, life begins to go with the flow. On the other hand, when the mind is fed with truth, faith, and spiritual direction, something different begins to happen. Choices change, posture changes, and even in the midst of difficulties, there is firmness. Maybe you've never stopped to think about it this way, but many paths that seem external started internally. A decision that seemed small, a thought that was accepted without question, an idea that gained space. Gradually, this is building a reality. And that is exactly why God teaches to guard the mind so carefully, not as someone who lives in fear, but as someone who understands the value of what they carry inside them. Guarding the mind is not blocking everything, it is discerning what can remain. It is to perceive when a thought does not come to edify, but to weaken. It's identifying when something tries to steal your peace before any situation even happens. And this process requires attention, because many thoughts arrive in a subtle way, disguised as worry, logic, or even protection. But deep down, they only feed insecurity and lead you away from trust in God. When you start watching that, something changes. You stop being automatically carried away by what you feel or think and start choosing with more awareness. This is liberating, because the mind ceases to be an uncontrolled place and becomes a protected environment where only that which is aligned with the truth remains. And the more you practice this, the more you realize that it's not just about avoiding bad thoughts, but about cultivating right thoughts. It's an exchange. It is a process of replacing what generates weight with what generates life. And this choice, made daily, begins to transform everything around her, even if silently at first. Now, simply but with true intent, state in the comments, "Lord, I receive your teachings." Write as an act of surrender, as someone who has decided to take care of what she thinks. And if this message made sense to you, leave your like, because other people also need to learn to protect their own mind and find that peace that starts from within. There is a deeper level of transformation that few truly understand. It's not just about clearing negative thoughts or replacing bad ideas with good ones. There is something bigger, something more powerful, receiving a new thought pattern. Because Jesus didn't just come to teach rules or behaviors, he came to reveal a new way of thinking, and that changes everything. The Bible declares something that at first glance may seem distant, but carries extraordinary power. But we have the mind of Christ. Stop for a moment and absorb it. It doesn't say that you can try to think better or that you need to reach an impossible level. It says that there is a mind available, an already established pattern that can be accessed. The mind of Christ does not react like the ordinary mind. Where many see a problem, she sees purpose. Where there is offense, she responds with mercy. Where there is fear, she remains at peace. This is not natural, it is spiritual. And maybe you think this is far from your reality, but this is exactly where the secret lies. This transformation does not happen from the outside in, but from the inside out. As you draw closer to God, something begins to quietly change. Your thoughts begin to align, your reactions begin to be different, and what once dominated your mind loses strength. Not because you fought harder, but because you are being transformed. Having the mind of Christ does not mean never having negative thoughts, but it means not being ruled by them. It is having the ability to recognize what does not come from God and choose not to stay in it. It is to develop a spiritual sensitivity that allows you to react differently, even in difficult situations. And this does not happen all at once, but it happens constantly as you allow yourself to live this closeness to God. And the more you understand this, the more you realize that clearing the mind is not just about removing what is bad, but allowing something new to occupy that space. Because emptiness never remains empty for long. Either you fill your mind with that which comes from God, or other thoughts will take that place. There is a change happening here, perhaps subtle, perhaps silent, but real. Something is being adjusted within you. A new way of seeing, thinking, reacting. And this does not depend on perfection, it depends on delivery. If this message is already touching your heart in some way, understand that it is not by chance. God reaches people at the right time, in the right way. And if you felt that, maybe it's time to take a simple but important step. When you like, subscribe, and activate the bell, this message begins to reach other lives that also need this transformation. Do it now, and become part of this current that brings light, faith, and direction to those who are still trying to find peace within their own mind. There is a type of voice that does not scream, but insists. She does not appear in front of others, but speaks within the mind, repeating mistakes, remembering failures, pointing out accusations that seem to have no end. It's the voice that makes you feel like it's never enough, that you're past the limit, that there's no turning back. And the most dangerous thing is that over time, this voice begins to sound true. The scene is strong. A woman surrounded, exposed, judged without defense. The voices around were harsh, accusing, full of condemnation. But what weighs most are not only the external voices, they are those that continue to echo from within, even when everything is silent. Because the most difficult accusation to overcome is not the one that comes from outside, it is the one that settles in the mind. Then Jesus enters, and everything changes. He does not ignore error, but neither does he feed condemnation. He does not reinforce the accusation, he dismantles the environment where she grows up. One by one, those who accused began to leave. And in the silence that remains, something arises that this woman perhaps did not expect to hear. Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. There is a profound difference here that transforms the mind. Jesus does not release guilt. He releases conscience with direction. He does not cling to the past, he points to a new path. Because while guilt paralyzes, grace frees us to start over. And perhaps this is exactly what many people still don't understand. They are still attached not to the mistake they made, but to the accusation they continue to carry. The mind that lives under constant accusation never finds rest. It always seems that something is missing, that it needs to pay, that it needs to be proved. But God does not work like that. It corrects, yes, but it also restores. It shows you the way, but also removes the weight that prevents you from walking. And maybe today you're carrying thoughts that should have been left behind by now, memories that come back, words that mark, mistakes that insist on defining who you are. But Jesus' voice remains the same. He doesn't ignore her story, but he doesn't allow it to be a prison either. Mind clearing goes through this point. Learning to silence the voices that God is no longer hearing about you. Because when he forgives, he doesn't revisit. When he cleanses, he does not accuse. And when he transforms, he doesn't keep you stuck with what's left behind. And maybe this is an important moment, not only for you, but for someone who is connected to your life. Someone who also needs to be reached by this liberation, who is perhaps living under silent accusations. If a name has come to your heart right now, don't ignore it. Write that person's name in the comments. It may be simple, but it is an act of faith. As you write, you also intercede, and when faith moves, something begins to happen beyond what the eye can see. There is a decisive moment in the spiritual life that almost no one notices when it is happening. It is not when everything is calm, nor when the answers are clear, but exactly in the middle of chaos. When the wind blows strongly, when circumstances seem out of control, when everything around draws more attention than what God has already said. It is in this environment that focus becomes more than important. It becomes vital. Pedro lived this intensely. He was not in a safe place. He was not on dry land. He was on the water. And while their eyes were fixed on Jesus, something impossible was happening. He walked on what, for anyone else, would be a reason for sinking. This reveals a profound principle. When the mind is aligned with Christ, the impossible ceases to be a barrier and becomes a path. But the scenario has not changed. The wind was still strong, the waves were still rough, and in an instant, Pedro does something that seems small, but changes everything. He diverts the focus, he feels the wind, observes the chaos, and at that moment, his mind leaves what sustained his faith and begins to react to what threatens his safety. The result is immediate. Fear enters, and where fear dominates, faith loses space. But when he felt the strong wind, he was afraid, and beginning to go to the bottom, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Notice this deeply, because this scene repeats itself in different ways every day. It is not that God has ceased to sustain, it is that the mind has changed direction. The focus has shifted from Christ to the problem. And when that happens, even what was working starts to look unstable. The mind needs to be trained to stay, even when everything around tries to distract. Because distraction doesn't seem dangerous at first, but little by little it weakens what sustains you. A thought here, a worry there, a diverted attention, and when you realize it, you are no longer as firm as before. But there is something powerful about this moment. Even as he begins to sink, Peter cries out. And it shows that even when the mind fails, there is still a way back. Jesus does not delay. He does not hesitate. He extends his hand. This reveals that the problem is not having moments of distraction, but staying in them. There is always an opportunity to reposition the focus, and perhaps today that is exactly what needs to happen. Not to change everything around you, but to adjust to where your mind is looking. Because what you constantly observe begins to directly influence how you feel and how you react. Nothing happens by chance. If you've made it this far, there's something being dealt with inside of you. and what is yet to be revealed can further strengthen your mind and your faith. Stay until the end, because God still has something specific to speak to your heart, something that can change how you face everything you are experiencing right now. There is a point in the spiritual journey where the mind begins to restless, not because of lack of faith, but because of an excess need for control. This is when questions arise that seem to have no immediate answers, paths that are not entirely clear, decisions that require a step before any guarantee. And it is exactly in this place that many stop, because the human mind has been trained to want to understand before acting, to want security before moving. But God works in a completely different way. When Abraham was called, he did not receive a detailed plan. He did not have all the steps explained. He did not see the destination before he left. He only heard a direction, and this, in itself, already confronts the logic of those who need certainty to continue. By faith, Abraham, he left, not knowing where he was going. There is something powerful about this decision, because it reveals that spiritual clarity does not come before obedience. It manifests itself during the journey. The restless mind tries to anticipate everything. It wants to predict, calculate, guarantee, but the more you try to control it, the more you get tired. Because there are areas of life that are not meant to be dominated by logic, but driven by trust. And while the mind insists on having all the answers, it is filled with anxiety, doubts, scenarios that are not always real. God does not feed this need for control. He doesn't deliver the complete map. He delivers enough direction for the next step. And that requires something that goes beyond understanding. It requires trust. Because obeying without seeing clearly is not weakness. It is faith in action. And it is in this process that the mind begins to be cleansed of one of the heaviest burdens it can carry, the illusion that it needs to control everything. Maybe you're living just that right now. A phase in which not everything makes sense, where the answers seem incomplete, where the future is not fully defined. And this can generate deep discomfort because the mind tries to fill these spaces with worry. But it is precisely in this environment that God works most intensely. It teaches you to depend, to trust, to walk even without seeing everything. And something starts to change when you accept that you don't have to understand everything to continue. The pressure decreases, the weight is relieved, and the mind finds space to rest. Because trust replaces anxiety and faith begins to lead where before there was only doubt. Abraham did not walk because he knew exactly what would happen. He walked because he trusted the one who called him. And this is the key that transforms the mind. It's not about having all the answers. It's about knowing who you're trusting. And when this becomes real within you, the confusion begins to lose strength, giving way to a peace that does not depend on complete explanations, but on a silent certainty that God is leading every step, even when the path is not yet fully visible. There are memories that do not stay in the past. They continue to live inside the mind, influencing feelings, decisions, and even the way you see yourself. These are experiences that have marked, words that have hurt, situations that seem too unfair to simply be forgotten. And the problem is not remembering. The problem is when these memories continue to carry pain, weight, and resentment as if they were still happening. Jose experienced something like this, but in an intense way. He was rejected, betrayed by those who were supposed to protect him, sold, forgotten. Humanly speaking, he had every reason to develop a mind marked by revolt. And this is exactly where one of the deepest secrets of mental transformation lies. Because even though he carried a difficult story, he did not allow his mind to be dominated by bitterness. This doesn't mean that he ignored what happened, nor that he simply forgot. It means that he decided to see his story from a different perspective. "You meant evil against me, but God has made it good." This phrase does not erase the pain, but reveals something greater than it. It shows that there is a way of looking at the past that does not imprison, but liberates. The mind that is not healed gets stuck in cycles. He relives situations, feeds old feelings, creates interpretations that reinforce the pain. And without realizing it, the person remains emotionally connected to something that has already passed. This becomes a silent prison, because while the body moves on, the mind remains in the same place. God does not change the past, but He transforms the meaning of it within you. He does not erase history, but rewrites the way it is seen. And that changes everything. Because when pain loses the power to define who you are, it stops being a burden and becomes part of a greater purpose. Perhaps there are things within you that have not yet been fully healed. Memories that come back, feelings that still tighten, thoughts that arise when you least expect it. And this is not a sign of weakness, it is a sign that there is still something that God wants to treat with care. Mind clearing passes through this sensitive point, allowing God to touch what you may have avoided revisiting, not to bring more pain, but to bring healing, because what is given to Him ceases to be a prison and begins to become a testimony. And when this starts to happen, something changes profoundly. The mind becomes lighter, the heart finds rest, and what once hurt loses its strength. Not because it was erased, but because it was transformed. That word didn't come to you by chance. There is something being dealt with within you right now, silently but really. If this touched your soul in any way, write in the comments, "I trust in God." Let this be a simple but true statement, marking the beginning of a new way of seeing even what once hurt. There is a subtle deception that can hold the mind even when a person believes he is close to God. It is when one confuses spiritual activity with spiritual alignment. Not everything that seems spiritual comes from a truly aligned heart, and not every experience with God means that the mind is clear. This is one of the most delicate points of the journey, because it is not something easily visible. The story of Balaam reveals just that. He listened to God, had spiritual experiences, received direction, but at the same time, there was something inside him that wasn't completely surrendered. Hidden interests, hidden desires, intentions that were not fully aligned with God's will. And that's where the danger lies, because a mind can seem connected, but still be divided. Then God said to Balaam, "You shall not go with them, nor curse this people." The direction was clear. There was no doubt. But even so, he kept negotiating, kept considering other possibilities. This reveals something profound. When the mind is not fully aligned, it tries to adapt God's will to its own intentions. And this generates a spiritual illusion, where the person thinks he is on the right path, but in fact he is gradually deviating. Discernment enters exactly at this point. It's not just about listening, but about obeying completely. It's not just about feeling something spiritual, but about living according to what God has already made clear. Because a clean mind is not one that only seeks experiences, but one that surrenders to the truth, even when it confronts personal desires. Maybe you've never thought of it that way, but there are times when the biggest confusion doesn't come from a lack of direction, but from the resistance to accepting what has already been shown. The mind begins to justify, to adapt, to find alternative paths that seem acceptable, but which deep down are just ways to avoid a complete surrender. And this is where the mind cleansing becomes more profound. It doesn't just happen when negative thoughts are removed, but when intentions are aligned, when that which is hidden ceases to rule silently, when the truth is no longer just heard and starts to be lived. Because there is no point in having clarity if there is no decision. There is no point in receiving direction if there is no obedience. The mind needs to be whole, without divisions, without internal negotiations. And when that happens, the confusion begins to fade. giving way to a clarity that doesn't depend on constant signs, but on a heart that's fully aligned with God. If you are here, it is not by chance. There is something being adjusted within you, something deeper than words, something that can change the way you view your own spiritual walk. Don't leave here before you've received all that God still wants to reveal, because what comes next can open your eyes in a way you've never experienced before. There is something that goes beyond trying to control thoughts or filter ideas manually. There is a level where the very presence of God begins to transform the mind in such a profound way that what was once attractive no longer has the same power. It's not effort, it's a consequence. It is not a constant struggle, it is a change of nature. And this is evident when one observes what happened to Moses. He went up to the mountain, entered the presence of God, remained there, exposed to something that cannot be explained with words alone. And when he came down, something was different. I did not know that the skin of his face shone after he had spoken with God. This was not just an external sign, it was the reflection of an internal transformation. God's presence didn't just speak to him, it marked, shaped, and altered his inner structure. And here is a point that many have not yet realized. The mind is not only purified by what you try to avoid, but mainly by the spiritual environment to which you expose yourself. When someone remains in the presence of God, something begins to change in a natural way. Thoughts that once seemed normal begin to bother you. Ideas that were previously accepted are now rejected, not out of obligation, but because they no longer match what is being generated inside. God's presence works like an invisible filter. It not only guides what to do, but purifies what to think. And the closer someone gets, the more sensitive they become. That which previously went unnoticed is now clearly discerned. The mind ceases to be confused and begins to align itself almost imperceptibly but steadily. Perhaps what is missing is not more effort to control thoughts, but more time in presence, because there are things that are not resolved in force, but in proximity. God doesn't just point the way, He transforms those who walk. And this transformation starts from within, directly reaching the way of thinking. Moses did not come down from the mountain trying to look different. He came down different without realizing it. This reveals that when God does, it is not superficial, it is profound. And when the mind is touched by this presence, it begins to reflect something new, something that cannot be produced by human will alone. And perhaps you now understand that clearing the mind is not just about removing what is bad, but allowing God to take up enough space so that what does not belong to Him simply no longer finds a place. God has done things in your life that often go unnoticed, inner changes, silent adjustments, deliverances that you haven't even seen. If in your heart there is the recognition that He has been good, even in the details, write in the comments, Amen. Sometimes a simple word carries a profound truth that connects you even more with what God is already doing within you. There is something that holds many people without them realizing it. They are not visible chains, they are not closed doors, but patterns that repeat themselves within the mind. Thoughts that come back, reactions that repeat themselves, feelings that seem too familiar. And the most dangerous thing is that, over time, this starts to look normal, as if it were just the way of being, when in fact it is a cycle that has never been broken. The people of Israel lived exactly that. They left Egypt, were physically freed, crossed the sea, saw miracles, but something inside them was still trapped. The mind was still in the same place as before. And this was evident in the words, in the attitudes, in the reactions. In the face of any difficulty, the pattern repeated itself, murmuring, fear, doubt, as if external freedom had not reached the interior. How long shall I suffer this wicked congregation, which murmurs against me? This question reveals something profound. God wasn't just dealing with behaviors, He was confronting a mental pattern that hindered advancement. Because it is not enough to leave a physical place if the mind continues to live in it. There is no point in changing the environment if the thoughts remain the same. Perhaps this explains why some people move forward in certain areas of life but remain stuck in others, because there are internal cycles that have not yet been broken. And these cycles don't break automatically over time. They need to be confronted. They need to be identified and replaced by a new way of thinking. The mind, accustomed to scarcity, continues to think as if nothing is enough. The mind, marked by fear, reacts even before understanding the situation. The mind that has lived for a long time in doubt has difficulty trusting, even when everything points to God's care. And as long as these patterns remain, life continues to spin in the same place. Even if outwardly everything looks different, God works exactly on this point. He doesn't just want to get you out of situations, He wants to get situations out of you. It confronts thoughts, exposes patterns, allows processes that reveal what still needs to be transformed. And that can be uncomfortable, because it requires real change, not just appearance. But it is in this process that something powerful happens. When you start noticing these cycles, you stop living on automatic. You start to see what was previously invisible, and that gives you the opportunity to choose differently, to react differently, to think differently, and little by little, what seemed impossible to change begins to lose strength. This word is not for any time. It is for those who are ready to get out of cycles that have lasted too long. If you've made it this far, there's something being revealed to you right now. Stay until the end, because there is still something that can definitely change the way you see and live your own mind. There is a silent force that tries to dominate the mind when the pressure increases. It's not just the problem itself, but the weight it generates inside. Racing thoughts, negative scenarios, fear anticipating what hasn't even happened yet. And it is in this environment that many give in, not because they are weak, but because the mind has not been strengthened to stand firm under pressure. Daniel lived in a setting where the pressure was not just emotional, it was real, concrete, and threatening. There was an order, a prohibition, a clear risk. He knew exactly what could happen if he continued doing what he had always done. And yet, his decision hasn't changed. Daniel, 3 times in the day, he knelt down and prayed and gave thanks before his God. This reveals something that goes beyond courage. It reveals a mind stabilized in God. He didn't wait for the pressure to pass to keep his faith. He did not adapt his practice to avoid the risk. He did not let the external environment determine his internal positioning. And this is rare, because most people adjust their mind according to the circumstances. If all is well, there is peace. If something threatens, fear takes over. But Daniel shows another way. A clean mind is not one that lives without challenges, but one that does not bow to them. It is a mind that has already been trained before the crisis hit. Because at the moment of pressure, you don't build structure, you reveal what already exists. And Daniel already had a routine, a connection, a constancy that sustained his mind even when everything around him tried to destabilize him. Perhaps what is most impressive is not the deliverance in the lion's den, but the peace before it. Because it is there that true strength is revealed, not in the visible miracle, but in the invisible steadfastness. A mind that does not negotiate with fear, that does not bend in the face of threat, that remains aligned even when everything tries to divert it. This shows that clearing the mind doesn't take away pressure, but it does change how you respond to it. Fear may even knock on the door, but it does not find room to dominate. Anxiety may try to catch on, but it does not govern decisions. There is a stability that comes not from circumstances, but from connection with God. And this connection is not only built in extreme moments, it is formed in everyday life, in small habits, in repeated choices, in the decision to keep the mind aligned, even when there is no pressure. Because when the difficult moment arrives, what was built in silence becomes its support. And perhaps now you realize that the secret is not in avoiding difficult situations, but in strengthening your mind before them. Because a strengthened mind does not despair easily, it is not lost quickly, it does not surrender without a struggle. It remains. And it is exactly this permanence that makes all the difference when the surrounding scenario tries to say otherwise. There is a kind of emptiness that cannot be filled with busyness, nor with distraction, nor with repeated attempts to move on. It is a silent emptiness, which often goes unnoticed in the middle of the routine, but which reveals itself in disorganized thoughts, in constant restlessness, in the feeling that something is missing, even when everything seems to be in place. And the deepest thing is that many times this is not a lack of effort, it is a lack of source. The Samaritan woman lived just like that. His life was full of stories, attempts, paths traveled, but there was still thirst, a headquarters that was not physical, it was internal. And perhaps the most striking thing is that she was already used to it. It was already part of the routine to search, try, come back, start over. But nothing really fulfilled. When Jesus meets that woman, he doesn't start talking about rules or mistakes. It goes straight to the root. He talks about thirst, about something she knew well, but perhaps had never been able to fully explain. And then he reveals something that changes everything. But whoever drinks of the water that I will give him will never thirst. This is not just a promise, it is a revelation. Because it shows that many disordered thoughts are not the main problem. They are just the reflection of a soul disconnected from the right source. When the soul is dry, the mind tries to compensate. She looks everywhere for answers, creates scenarios, worries, gets agitated, tries to find meaning. But nothing really stabilizes. God doesn't start by organizing thoughts. He starts by restoring the source. Because when the soul finds what it really needs, the mind begins to align naturally. The restlessness subsides, the thoughts calm down, and what once seemed confusing begins to find clarity. Maybe you're living just that, a phase where the mind seems too full, but at the same time empty, where there are many thoughts, but little peace. And that doesn't mean you're lost, it means there's a call to go back to the source. Not just any source, but the one that really satisfies. The water that Jesus offers is not temporary. It does not depend on circumstances. It does not need to be constantly replaced. It generates something inside, a stability, a peace that does not oscillate with everything around. And when this begins to happen, the mind stops racing in all directions and begins to rest. And perhaps this moment is more important than it seems. Because as you listen to this, something within you may be acknowledging that thirst, and recognizing it is the first step to change. Can you imagine how many people are living just that right now, trying to fill a void that only God can reach? Just as this message has come to you, it can reach other lives that also need this response. By liking, subscribing, and interacting, you become part of something bigger, taking this word to those who need to find this source that transforms from the inside out. There is a silent difference between an unstable mind and a steady mind, and that difference is not in the surrounding circumstances, but in what sustains the thoughts inside. Because when everything starts to change, when challenges arise, when the scenario is not clear, the mind needs something that does not oscillate along with the environment. And this is exactly where many get lost, because they try to find stability in something that changes all the time. Josue was given a huge responsibility, a path full of challenges, decisions, and uncertainties. And before he even went forward, God did not give him detailed military strategies, nor did he explain every step of what would happen. God gave something different. Let not the book of this law depart from thy mouth, but meditate on it day and night. This reveals that the key was not in the control of situations, but in the steadiness of the mind. Meditating is not just reading, it is repeating, absorbing, constantly bringing to memory. Because the mind needs to be reminded of the truth often, or it begins to align with what it sees around it. And the problem is that circumstances don't always reflect what God has promised. Often they seem to contradict, challenge, even generate doubt. That's why the promise needs to become an anchor, something that keeps the mind steady even when everything seems unstable. Because when the mind is based only on what is happening, it oscillates. But when it is based on what God has said, it remains. Perhaps you have experienced moments like this, where the reality around you seemed to say one thing, but inside you there was a different word. And in those moments, the decision is clear. Either you let yourself be carried away by what you see, or you stick to what God has already said. The repetition of the truth is not excess. It is necessity. Because there are voices, thoughts and influences trying to take up space all the time. And if the mind is not filled with that which comes from God, it will be filled with other things. Mind clearing happens when truth begins to take up more space than doubt. When what God has said becomes stronger than what you feel. And this does not happen automatically. It happens when you decide to turn your attention repeatedly to what sustains, to what edifies, to what does not change. Joshua did not move forward because everything was clear. He moved forward because his mind was steadfast. And this firmness did not come from outside. It came from what he decided to keep alive inside himself every day. Because a mind sustained by the promise does not get lost along the way. It continues, even when it does not understand everything, even when it does not see everything, because there is something greater sustaining each thought, each decision, and each step taken. There is a pain that does not make noise, that does not appear to others, but that weighs deeply within the mind. It is that pain that manifests itself in repetitive thoughts, in memories that come back without warning, in feelings that seem difficult to explain. And many times, those who go through this try to hide, try to be strong, try to continue as if nothing was happening. But inside, there is a constant dialogue that never finds rest. David knew this place well. He was not someone distant from God, on the contrary, he was someone deeply connected. And even so, he faced moments of intense anguish, emotional confusion, deep sadness. The difference is that he didn't try to hide it. He spoke, he put it out. He turned his thoughts into words before God. This reveals something essential for the cleansing of the mind. It's not denying the pain, it's not pretending that everything is fine, but it's taking all of this to the right place. Because when thoughts get stuck, they grow. When emotions are stifled, they intensify. But when they are delivered, something begins to change. The Lord is near to them that are broken-hearted. This truth completely changes the way we see pain, because it shows that God doesn't walk away when you're weak. He draws near. He doesn't ignore what you feel. He comes into that place with you. And this presence begins to transform what seemed to be just suffering into a space of intimacy. Perhaps what is missing is not more strength to endure, but more freedom to open oneself before God. Because the mind finds relief when it stops carrying everything on its own. When he understands that he does not need to organize everything before speaking, that he does not need to have perfect words, that he does not need to hide what is already seen by God. And it is in this process that something profound happens. Thoughts begin to lose weight, emotions begin to calm down, and what seemed disorganized begins to find a new place. Not because the pain disappeared immediately, but because now it is no longer being carried alone. David didn't just talk, he also listened, And in that dialogue, his mind was adjusted, strengthened, comforted, because when God comes in, he doesn't just listen, he transforms. It takes what was confusing and brings clarity, that which was heavy and brings relief, that which seemed meaningless and reveals purpose. If this message is finding something inside you that you may never have been able to fully explain, don't ignore this moment. As a simple way to answer this, write in the comments, "God takes care of me." Sometimes a statement like this isn't just a sentence, it's a reminder to your own mind that you're not alone in this process. There's a point in the journey when the mind becomes a closed loop, always revolving around the pain itself. Thoughts return to the same place, questions are repeated, feelings do not seem to advance. And the more the person tries to solve this by looking only at themselves, the more trapped they feel. It is as if everything inside is connected to suffering, as if there is no way out. Job arrived at this place. He lost, suffered, was misunderstood, carried deep pain that few could bear. His mind had enough reason to remain stuck in that scenario, and for a long time, everything revolved around what he was experiencing. But something happens that completely changes the direction of this cycle. And the Lord turned the captivity of Job when he prayed for his friends. This reveals a powerful and often overlooked principle. The change didn't start when everything around him changed. It started when something inside him changed direction. When he stopped looking only at his own pain and began to intercede for others. Interceding is not just a spiritual act, it is a mental repositioning. Because when you pray for someone, your mind moves out of the center of the problem and connects with a greater purpose. What used to occupy all the space begins to lose strength. Pain still exists, but it no longer dominates as before. God teaches something profound here. There are times when the liberation of the mind comes not only from receiving, but from releasing. It doesn't just come from looking for yourself, but from placing yourself as a channel for others. This breaks internal cycles because it changes the focus. And when the focus changes, the mind begins to breathe in a different way. Maybe you're in a moment where your thoughts are very focused on what you're experiencing. And this is natural to a certain extent. But there is a level beyond that, where God invites you to look outside, to carry someone in prayer, to connect with something greater than your own pain. And it is in this movement that something begins to happen silently. The mind aligns, the weight decreases, the perspective changes. Because when you become an instrument, you are also reached. When you release, you also receive. Job didn't just come out of suffering for time, he came out when his mind left the center of pain and entered the flow of purpose. And this shows that mind clearing is not only an internal process, but also a movement of direction. What you will notice from now on can completely change the way you see your own internal battles. There is something that God still wants to show you, something that few understand at the right time. Stay until the end, because this revelation may be just what your mind needs to take a new step. There is a point where the mind does not need more information, more advice, or more attempts to solve everything at once. There is a point where what she really needs is to slow down, because an overloaded mind begins to look for answers in intensity, in constant movement, in the excess of thoughts trying to find a way out. But God does not work at this pace. He does not compete with noise. He reveals himself in stillness. Elijah came to exactly that place. After experiencing intense moments, facing deep pressures, his mind was exhausted. He didn't need more events. He needed inner reorganization. And then God takes him to a different environment, a place of silence, a place where everything that was external loses strength, and what is internal begins to be treated. And something impressive happens. The wind comes, strong, impactful. Then the earthquake, then the fire. Everything that would attract attention, everything that would seem to be a sign of powerful manifestation. But God was not in any of these. And then comes something almost imperceptible, a still, small voice. And that's where everything changes. And after the fire, a still, small voice, and it came to pass when Elijah heard it. This reveals one of the deepest principles of mind clearing. God doesn't need intensity to transform, he needs space. While the mind is filled with noises, worries, and racing thoughts, even God's direction can go unnoticed. Not because he didn't speak, but because there wasn't enough silence to listen. Perhaps what is missing is not more search, but more pause. Because there is a difference between being spiritually active and being spiritually sensitive. And this sensitivity is born when the mind slows down, when the heart quiets down, when the interior stops running and begins to listen. Spiritual silence is not empty, it is treatment. It is in this place that God reorganizes thoughts, adjusts emotions, brings clarity where there was confusion before, not abruptly but deeply and continuously. And the more you learn to stay in that environment, the more your mind becomes stable, aligned and light. Elias did not find direction in the noise, he found it in silence. And this completely changes the way we understand how God works. Because while many are looking for answers in big moves, God is waiting for a moment of stillness to speak that which truly transforms. And perhaps now you realize that the cleansing of the mind does not begin when everything around you changes, but when within you there is enough space to hear what God is already saying, even if it is in a soft voice, almost imperceptible, but profoundly capable of reorganizing everything. There is a level of mental disorder that goes beyond the common confusion. It is when the mind seems fragmented, as if several voices speak at the same time, pulling in different directions, generating a constant state of restlessness, suffering, and loss of identity. This is when the person can no longer recognize who they really are, because everything inside seems too messy. And perhaps, on some level, you felt it, not in the same extreme way, but at times when your own thoughts seemed out of control. That man lived like that, isolated, distant, trapped in a cycle of pain and self-destruction. He dwelt among tombs, a place that symbolizes death, silence, and abandonment. But the strongest thing was not the physical place, it was the state of mind, dominated by forces he did not control, without peace, without clarity, without rest. And then Jesus arrives, and when he comes on the scene, there is no negotiation with chaos. He does not try to manage disorder, he transforms completely. The liberation was not partial, it was not superficial, it was total. What seemed impossible to restore was completely reorganized. And they came to Jesus and saw the demoniac man, clothed and in his right mind. This image carries profound power. He who was once lost within himself was now at peace. The mind that was a field of confusion was now a place of clarity. The identity that was fragmented was now restored. This reveals something essential. When God clears the mind, he doesn't make superficial adjustments. He transforms the structure. He doesn't just silence what's wrong, he establishes what's right. He doesn't just remove chaos, he builds order. Maybe you're not living something extreme like this story, but there are areas of the mind that are still disorganized, thoughts that haven't found peace yet, emotions that don't seem to fit. And this shows that the transformation that God makes has no limits. It reaches from the deepest to the most subtle levels. A restored mind becomes a testimony, not only for what he says, but for what he transmits. There is a peace that begins to be perceived, a clarity that did not exist before, a firmness that does not depend on circumstances. And this is not something that is easily explained, it is something that is lived. And perhaps this is an important time for you to recognize areas that still need this intervention, not with fear but with hope. Because the same God who completely transformed that mind continues to transform today. Before we continue, there is something simple but powerful that you can do right now. If there is something that has weighed on your mind, something that you feel needs to be restored, write your prayer request in the comments. It could be something personal, something for your family, or something you can't even explain properly. By doing this, you are not just writing, you are putting before God and connecting with a current of faith where lives are being touched and transformed. There is a type of thinking that imprisons without making noise. It's not an external voice. It's not something that someone said recently, but an internal belief that has been built up over time. It's that feeling of not being capable, of not being enough, of not being ready. And the most dangerous thing is that when it settles in the mind, it starts to feel true. The person starts to live based on this perception, limiting decisions, avoiding steps, and doubting even what God has already said. Gideon was in that very place. When God calls you, he doesn't find someone confident, ready, or secure. He finds someone hidden, insecure, full of doubts about himself. And yet, the first thing God says has nothing to do with what Gideon was feeling. "The Lord is with thee, thou mighty man of valor." This statement breaks all human logic, because God does not speak based on the current state of Gideon's mind. He speaks based on what he already sees. And here is a profound principle of mental cleansing. God doesn't just remove wrong thoughts, he replaces them with a new identity. He doesn't just correct, he resets. But Gideon does not absorb it immediately. Your mind is still stuck in the old beliefs. He questions, asks for signs, seeks confirmations, and instead of rejecting it, God responds. He confirms, he reinforces, he shows again and again that what he has said is true. This reveals something important. God understands the process. He knows that a mind marked by insecurity does not change all at once, but can be transformed with patience and constant truth. Maybe you're experiencing something like that too. An internal struggle that is not in the circumstances, but in the way you see yourself. Thoughts that say that it is not enough, that it cannot be done, that it is not capable. And even when something good comes up, there is an inner resistance that prevents you from believing completely. The cleansing of the mind goes through this point. It's not just rejecting negative thoughts, but accepting what God says about you. Because while you continue to believe in old versions of yourself, your life continues to be limited by something that God has already decided to transform. God doesn't see how you see yourself today. He sees beyond. He sees the potential, the purpose, what is still being built. And when you start aligning your mind with that vision, something changes profoundly. Insecurity begins to lose strength, doubt begins to weaken, and a new type of thinking begins to emerge, firmer, clearer, more aligned. Gideon didn't start strong, but he finished differently. Not because circumstances changed first, but because his mind began to align with what God was saying. And this process continues to happen. Because every time an inner lie is replaced by God's truth, the mind becomes freer, cleaner, and closer to what it was truly created to be. There is a type of scenario that seems impossible to sustain inside. When everything around points to loss, when the environment offers no signs of improvement, when the pain is not momentary, but continuous. It is in this place that the mind begins to be pressured intensely, because everything you see tries to define what you feel. And many end up giving in, not because of lack of faith, but because they can't see beyond what's happening. Jeremiah lived exactly that. He did not speak from a comfortable place. He did not observe a tranquil reality. He was surrounded by destruction, by pain, by a scenario that humanly offered no hope. And yet in the midst of it all, he declares something that completely breaks with what his eyes were seeing. The mercies of the Lord are the cause of our not being consumed. They are renewed every morning. This statement did not come from a favorable environment. It came from an internal decision. This reveals one of the deepest points of mind clearing. It does not depend on what is happening around you, but on what you decide to keep alive within you, because when the mind is based only on what it sees, it becomes unstable. But when she anchors herself in who God is, she finds steadfastness even in difficult scenarios. Jeremiah did not ignore the pain. He recognized it. He felt, he expressed, he lived that moment. But he didn't allow that to be the only truth inside his mind. He chose to remember something bigger. He chose to bring to mind what sustained his faith. And that changed everything. Maybe you're in a time where everything seems too heavy, where external signals don't help, where the mind starts to fill up with thoughts that pull you down. And this may seem difficult to control because the environment influences, but there is a key here, the decision to remember. Remember that God's mercy does not depend on your current moment. Remember that there is renewal, even when everything seems repetitive. Remember that what you are experiencing does not define what God can still do. And when that memory starts to take up space, the mind starts to change direction. Hope is not born because everything has improved. It is born because something inside has been strengthened. And when this happens, even if the scenario has not yet changed, there is a stability that begins to emerge. A kind of peace that makes no sense to those who look from the outside, but that sustains those who live inside. And perhaps this message came to you at this very moment, not by chance, but because there is something that God wants to rekindle within you. Something that does not depend on what you are seeing now, but on what He continues to do, even if you do not yet fully realize it. If this touched you in any way, write in the comments, "God chose me." Because sometimes stating this is not just a phrase, it is a positioning of the mind in the face of everything that tries to make you forget who you are and who you are trusting. There is a time in life when the biggest barrier is not on the outside, but inside the mind. It is not circumstances that prevent it. It is not the people around us, but silent thoughts that limit what God has already decided. That's when questions like, why me? Am I capable? What if it goes wrong? And these questions, when they are not confronted, begin to define choices, blocking steps that should be taken. Esther lived exactly this conflict. She was not someone who saw herself as the protagonist of something great. His position seemed unlikely. His context did not point to such a high purpose, but there was something bigger going on, something she still couldn't fully see. And when the decisive moment arrived, the biggest challenge was not external, it was internal. Fear began to speak. Insecurity tried to take over. Then comes a word that changes everything. And who knoweth whether thou hast come to this kingdom for such a time as this? This phrase not only brings awareness, it awakens identity. It shows that what seemed like chance was actually purpose, that what seemed like luck was actually direction, and that the place where she was not a mistake, it was part of a larger plan. This reveals something profound about the mind. Often it limits what God has already established. Not because God can't do it, but because the person can't see himself within what he has already declared. And while this inner vision does not change, life remains smaller than it could be. The cleansing of the mind passes through this decisive point. Letting go of thoughts of inadequacy is not just motivation, it is spiritual alignment. It is to begin to see oneself not by the limitations of the past, but by God's direction. It is to understand that the call does not depend on perfection, but on willingness. Esther did not cease to feel fear, but she decided not to be ruled by him. That changes everything, because courage is not the absence of fear, it is decision in spite of it. And when this decision happens, the mind breaks through an invisible barrier. What once seemed impossible is starting to become accessible. Maybe you're living in a moment when something inside you knows there's more, but at the same time, limiting thoughts try to hold you back. Doubts, insecurities, memories of the past. But there is a truth that needs to be activated. If God has put you where you are, there is a purpose in it. And when this truth begins to take up space, the mind aligns. Fear loses strength and a new perception begins to emerge. Not based on what you feel, but on what God has already determined. Maybe you've been waiting for an answer for a long time, trying to understand the why of certain things, the meaning of certain paths. And maybe this moment is exactly the answer you needed. Stay until the end, because that which is yet to be revealed may confirm something within you that was just waiting for the right moment to awaken. There is a detail that many people overlook when facing great challenges. They believe that the battle begins when the problem arises, when the situation becomes visible, when the confrontation takes place before their eyes. But the truth is that it all starts much earlier, in a place that no one sees. It starts in the mind. In front of Goliath, there was an entire army paralyzed, not because they lacked strength, not because they lacked resources, but because they had already lost inside. The giant didn't just dominate the field, he dominated the thoughts. Everyone looked and saw the same thing, an impossible obstacle, a threat too great, a defeat announced before even trying. But when David arrives, something is different. The scenario is the same, the giant is the same, the words are the same. What changes is the way of seeing. While everyone saw a problem, he saw an opportunity. While everyone was guided by fear, he was guided by faith. And this reveals a powerful principle. Spiritual victory begins in the way the mind interprets what is before it. You come to me with a sword, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts. This statement wasn't made at the final moment. It already existed within him before he even entered the battle. This shows that David did not build courage there. He only revealed what was already formed in his mind. The clear mind does not deny reality, but it is not limited to it. She sees beyond. She acknowledges the problem, but does not allow him to define the outcome. And that changes everything, because the way you see determines the way you react. Maybe there are situations in your life that seem too big, challenges that seem difficult to face, thoughts that say it won't work out. And without realizing it, this begins to weaken your posture, your decision, your confidence. But there is a change that can happen now, not in the size of the problem, but in the way you are seeing it. When the mind aligns itself with what God says, fear loses space. Not because everything has become easy, but because there is a greater certainty sustaining each thought. And this certainty does not come from circumstances, it comes from the presence of God. David didn't win because he was stronger, he won because he thought differently. Because while everyone was dominated by thoughts of defeat, he was aligned with the truth that came from above, and that made all the difference. If this message has reached you, there is a purpose in it. Maybe it's time to adjust your way of seeing what's in front of you. And if you want to continue receiving words that strengthen your mind and faith, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and leave your like. Because what you are beginning to understand here can still transform much more within you. There is a silent danger that often goes unnoticed on the spiritual journey. It is not a direct attack, it is not something visible, but a subtle tendency to isolation. Gradually, the person moves away, closes himself off, begins to deal with everything alone. And what seems like just a moment of retreat can become an environment where the mind is more vulnerable than it imagines. The mind, when isolated, begins to spin without filter. Thoughts are not confronted, emotions are not shared, and what could be corrected quickly begins to grow. Small doubts become big uncertainties. Concerns gain strength. And without realizing it, the person enters a cycle where everything happens only within him, without exchange, without support, without external direction. God never designed the walk to be lonely. From the beginning, He lays down a clear principle through fellowship. The early church lived this intensely, and they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine, and in fellowship, and in the breaking of bread, and in prayers. This was not just a religious habit, it was a spiritual protection. When there is true communion, the mind finds balance. What alone might seem confusing, together finds clarity. What could generate discouragement when shared finds strengthening. There is something powerful about the exchange, because God uses people to align, correct, and sustain thoughts. Perhaps you have already noticed that at times, just the right conversation completely changes the way you were seeing a situation. This is no coincidence. It is God using communion as an instrument of care, because when the mind walks alone for too long, it starts to rely only on itself, and that can be dangerous. The unit generates protection, not because everyone thinks the same, but because there is an environment where the truth circulates, where faith is shared, where the presence of God manifests itself in a collective way. And in this environment, the mind finds a kind of security that it cannot build on its own. This does not mean totally depending on other people, but it does mean not disconnecting from what God has created as a support. Communion does not weaken, it strengthens. It does not limit, it expands. Because when you connect with others who are also seeking God, your mind is constantly reminded of what really matters. And perhaps this is an important point to reflect on, not just about what you've been thinking, but about who you've been walking with. Because the health of your mind is also linked to the spiritual environment you choose to be a part of. And when this choice is aligned with God, something begins to adjust naturally, bringing more firmness, more clarity, and more protection to everything that happens inside you. There is a type of noise that does not only come from outside, but that invades the mind little by little, filling each space with distractions, worries, information, and voices that compete for attention. It is a constant noise, often invisible, but profoundly influential. And the more this noise grows, the more difficult it becomes to understand what really matters. The mind is too busy to discern, too full to hear clearly. But there is one truth that changes everything. God does not depend on the environment to speak. He does not need external silence to manifest himself, but he seeks a sensitive mind to be heard. João was in a completely unfavorable scenario, isolated, remote, suffering. Everything around could indicate distance, abandonment, or silence. But it was exactly there that something extraordinary happened. I was caught up in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a loud voice as of a trumpet. This reveals that even in the midst of a limited environment, his mind was connected. He wasn't distracted by what was around him. He was sensitive to what was coming from above, and this sensitivity made all the difference. Mind cleansing goes through this essential point. It's not just about removing negative thoughts, but learning how to reduce the volume of the world to amplify God's voice. Because while everything speaks at the same time, the voice that really matters can be ignored, not by absence, but by lack of attention. Perhaps the greatest challenge today is not God speaking, but the mind being available to listen. Because there are many distractions that seem harmless, but that take up space, consume energy, and weaken spiritual sensitivity. And without realizing it, the person begins to live guided by everything but the voice of God. John shows that it doesn't matter where you are. What matters is how your mind is positioned. Even in a place of isolation, he was spiritually connected. This means that no circumstance can prevent God from revealing himself, but distraction can prevent you from noticing. And when the mind begins to adjust, when it learns to silence the excess and focus on the essential, something powerful happens. God's voice ceases to seem distant and begins to become clear, not because it has changed, but because there is now space to listen to it. Few people will understand the depth of this because it requires more than listening to words. It requires a willingness to adjust the interior. But if you're here, there's a reason. God is speaking directly, dealing with something specific within you. Continue to the end, because that which is yet to be revealed can bring you to a level of clarity that you have never experienced before. There is a silent, almost imperceptible moment when everything begins to change within a person. It's not when circumstances improve, it's not when someone from the outside intervenes, but when something happens in the mind. It is an inner awakening, a realization that breaks the cycle in which the person was trapped. Because before any true return, there is a point of consciousness. The prodigal son arrived at exactly this place. He did not start his story thinking about returning. On the contrary, his choices took him away to a path where, little by little, everything was lost: resources, direction, identity. And the further he advanced on this path, the more his mind moved away from what was his origin. But something happens. And he came to himself and said, this expression carries a depth that many do not realize. He came to his senses. This means that before changing places, he changed his mind. Before taking any physical steps, something inside was rearranged. He realized where he was, recognized his condition, and, above all, remembered something he had forgotten. True repentance begins there. It's not just feeling sadness for what happened. It's not just emotion. It's clarity. It is when the mind stops justifying, denying, running away, and begins to see reality with truth. And this clarity generates decision. Because when someone truly understands where they are, the next step becomes inevitable. Mind clearing begins at this point, when there is awareness, when what was confused becomes evident, when the person stops deceiving themselves and starts to face what needs to be transformed. And this is not a process of condemnation, it is a process of liberation. Maybe there are areas of your life where you've already realized that something needs to change, but there hasn't been a complete decision yet. Thoughts that you know should not continue, paths that have already shown not to lead to the right place, but that still remain out of habit or resistance. Regret is not a burden, it is an opportunity. It is the chance to reorganize the mind, to realign with what is true, to return to a place where there is direction, peace, and purpose. And all of this begins within, before any external change. The prodigal son did not come back because everything got better around him. He came back because something inside him woke up. And this awakening changed everything. Because when the mind changes, the path also changes. When perception changes, choices begin to go in a new direction. And perhaps this is the exact moment when something inside you begins to adjust. A clarity that emerges, a perception that can no longer be ignored. Because true transformation does not begin when everything is perfect. It begins when the mind decides not to continue in the same place, making room for a new beginning that is already being prepared. There is a silent belief that many carry without realizing it. The idea that peace will only be possible when everything is resolved around them. As if the mind depended on circumstances to stabilize itself, as if it were necessary for problems to disappear in order to feel rest. But the truth revealed in Scripture directly confronts this logic. Paul writes about peace in a place where, humanly speaking, it should not exist. He was trapped, limited, surrounded by a reality that could easily generate anguish, revolt, or despair. And yet, his words do not reflect imprisonment, they reflect freedom. This shows something profound. His mind was not tied to the environment, it was connected to something bigger. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. This peace does not depend on explanation. It does not depend on logic. It does not depend on a favorable scenario. It exceeds understanding because it does not follow human standards. It comes from a constant presence, from a connection that is not interrupted by external circumstances. This completely changes the way we see mind clearing, because it's not about waiting for everything to line up outside, but about allowing something to settle inside. A clear mind is not one that never faces challenges, but one that remains guarded even when challenges are present. Guarding the mind is not just about avoiding negative thoughts. It is about allowing God's presence to take up enough space to protect what happens inside. It is like an environment where, even with external noise, there is an internal stability that is not easily shaken. Perhaps you have experienced times when everything seemed uncertain, but even so, there was a peace that did not make sense. Or maybe you're living the opposite, where even without major problems, the mind doesn't find rest. This reveals that true peace is not connected to what happens outside, but to what is sustaining you inside. Paul did not write about something theoretical, he lived. And this shows that there is a level of connection with God that guards the mind in a real, practical, and constant way. It does not eliminate challenges, but prevents them from dominating. It does not prevent difficulties, but it prevents them from controlling thoughts. And when that presence becomes constant, something changes profoundly. The mind stops oscillating with everything that happens and starts to stand firm, not because everything is fine, but because there is something greater sustaining each thought. If this message is bringing clarity to something you needed to understand, don't let it pass as just another moment. Write in the comments, "I trust in God's action." Sometimes stating this is more than words. It's aligning the mind with a truth that can begin to transform everything from the inside out. There is a difference that many do not notice when they seek transformation in the mind. They value intense moments, deep experiences, words that impact. But they forget that true change is not only sustained in these spiritual peaks, because what is not maintained on a daily basis is lost over time. And this is exactly where an essential principle, spiritual discipline, comes in. Paul understood this clearly. He didn't just rely on strong moments, he built an aligned life every day. But I subdue my body and bring it into bondage. This statement reveals something profound. He didn't let his mind be guided only by emotions or impulses. He made conscious decisions. He chose to align his thoughts, even when it wasn't easy, even when it required resignation. This shows that mind clearing is not automatic. It requires vigilance, because thoughts don't stop emerging, influences don't cease to exist, distractions keep trying to take up space. And if there is no constant positioning, the mind begins to become disorganized again. Perhaps you have experienced moments when you felt spiritually strong, with clarity, with peace, with direction. But after some time, he noticed that certain old thoughts began to come back, certain doubts reappeared, certain emotions gained space again. This does not mean that nothing has happened. It means that the process needs to be continuous. Spiritual discipline is not a burden. It is protection. It's what keeps the mind aligned even when there's no emotion. Because not every day will be intense, nor will every moment be easy. But when there is discipline, there is constancy. And this constancy builds a firm, resistant, prepared mind. An undisciplined mind becomes vulnerable. He reacts easily, gets distracted quickly, gets carried away by any thought that arises. But a mind trained in the Word begins to respond differently. She doesn't accept everything, she filters. She doesn't give in to any idea, she confronts it. This requires decision. It's not just about feeling like it, it's about choosing. Choose what to feed, choose what to reject, choose where to focus. And the more these choices are repeated, the more the mind is strengthened. Paulo didn't just live in moments, he lived in practice. And that's what sustained his mind, his faith, his clarity. Because in the end, it's not just what you feel in a moment that defines your life, but what you decide to keep every day. And it is in this continuous process that the mind is cleaned, strengthened, and aligned with what God wants, in a firm, constant, and deeper way. There is a spiritual detail that can completely transform the way the mind works, but it is often overlooked because it seems too simple. Gratitude, not as an automatic gesture or a repeated word, but as a posture that reorganizes the interior. Because the mind that does not learn to be grateful begins, little by little, to get used to scarcity, to focus on what is lacking, to amplify the negative. The 10 lepers experienced the same miracle. Everyone was healed. Everyone received something that previously seemed impossible. But only one returned. Only one interrupted the path to recognize. And one of them, seeing that he was healed, returned, glorifying God with a loud voice, and fell at the feet of Jesus, giving thanks to him. This return reveals something that goes beyond physical healing. It reveals an inner change. While the others went on with their lives, that man had his mind repositioned. He didn't just receive it, he recognized it. And this recognition made room for something bigger. Because gratitude doesn't just celebrate what happened, it aligns the mind with the source from which it came. Ingratitude, even if silent, begins to distort perception. The person starts to see more what they don't have than what they have already received. Small achievements lose value, blessings become commonplace, and the mind enters a cycle where nothing seems enough. This generates weight, generates dissatisfaction, generates constant restlessness. But when gratitude becomes practical, something changes profoundly. The mind begins to see beyond the circumstances. Even in the midst of challenges, she finds reasons to acknowledge. And this recognition brings light, because what once seemed little is starting to gain meaning. What was ignored begins to be valued. God shows that a grateful mind does not live stuck in the moment. It connects with that which is eternal. He understands that everything comes from Him, and this generates a kind of stability that does not depend on what is missing, but on what has already been received. Maybe you've never thought of it that way, but gratitude has the power to clear thoughts. It stops the murmuring, silences the negativity, and repositions the focus. Not because everything is perfect, but because the mind has chosen to see differently. And the more this practice becomes constant, the more the mind is strengthened, because it is no longer guided by lack and is guided by recognition. And this changes the way we live, think, react. That man came back different, not only healed, but transformed. Because while many receive and follow, few understand that recognizing is what sustains transformation. And it is in this detail, simple but profound, that the mind begins to be reprogrammed, finding lightness, clarity, and a peace that is born from a heart that has learned to see beyond what the eyes show. There is a decisive moment within the mind that many ignore. It is when a thought arrives, presents itself as truth, and finds space to remain. Most people believe that they have no control over it, that they just need to deal with what arises. But what Jesus reveals in the wilderness completely changes that perspective. The mind was not created to be passive. It was created to have positioning. In the wilderness, it wasn't just an outward temptation. It was a direct battle in the mind. Suggestions, distortions, ideas that tried to divert the purpose. And you see, it all started with thoughts. If thou art the Son of God. This phrase was not just a provocation. It was an attempt to generate doubt, to weaken identity, to create internal confusion. But Jesus does not negotiate with that. He does not analyze too much. He does not get involved. He does not allow that thought to develop. he answers, and he answers with something specific, with the truth. It is written, "Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God." This reveals a powerful principle. Thoughts don't have to be accepted, they can be confronted. Each attack was responded to in the same way. Not with emotion, not with human argument, but with the word. This shows that there is an authority available, a spiritual capacity to reject that which is not in line with God. The mind does not have to bow to everything that arises. It can position itself. Perhaps you have experienced moments when thoughts came with force, trying to generate fear, doubt, insecurity, and without realizing it, you began to pay attention, to analyze, to consider. And the more that happens, the more that thought grows. But there is a different way. It's not ignoring, it's confronting. Clearing the mind requires this positioning. It is not enough just to wish for peace. It is necessary to protect what enters and what remains. Because there are ideas that, if not interrupted, begin to influence everything. But when they are confronted with the truth, they lose strength. Jesus did not win because he avoided confrontation. He won because he knew how to respond. And that's available. The word is not just a text. It is a spiritual tool. It is what sustains, aligns, corrects. When you start applying that, something changes. The mind ceases to be a place of constant attacks and becomes an environment of authority, not because thoughts stop coming, but because there is now an answer to them. There is firmness, there is direction, and maybe that's exactly what you needed to understand today, that you are not without resources, you are not without a way out, you are not at the mercy of what you think. There is an authority that can be activated, a truth that can be applied, a way of living where the mind does not dominate you, but you, guided by God, learn to govern what happens within. In the next few moments, something even deeper will be revealed, something that can definitely change the way you see your own mind and your spiritual walk. Pay attention, because this might be just what you needed to hear today. There is a silent prison that imprisons the minds of many people even after they have already been forgiven. They are not visible chains, but constant thoughts of guilt, memories that come back, a sense that they are no longer worthy, that they have failed beyond the limit. And the most dangerous thing is that this begins to shape identity. The person stops seeing himself as someone in transformation and starts to see himself only for the mistake he made. Peter arrived at exactly that place. He didn't fail at something small. He denied Jesus 3 times. At the moment when most should stand firm, he gave in. And after that, his mind was not at peace. The guilt, the shame, the weight of that choice began to take up space. Because when someone fails at something they know they shouldn't, the mind becomes a difficult place to inhabit. But something happens that completely changes this scenario. Jesus does not ignore Peter. He does not dismiss him. He does not define him by what happened. On the contrary, he draws near, and in that meeting there is no accusation, there is restoration. Feed my sheep. This phrase carries a transformative power. Because she doesn't look at Pedro's past, she points to his future. This reveals a profound principle of mind clearing. God does not build your identity based on your mistake, but based on the purpose he has placed in you. While the mind insists on revisiting the past, God is pointing to what is yet to be built. Guilt tries to trap, but purpose releases. Shame tries to silence, but the restored identity repositions it. And when that truth begins to come in, something changes within the mind. What once weighed begins to lose strength, not because it was ignored, but because it was treated in the right way. Maybe there are things you still carry, mistakes you haven't forgotten, moments that still come back to your mind. And this generates an internal conflict because you want to move on, but something inside still pulls you back. But there is a truth that needs to be activated. God doesn't just see you for what you've done, He sees you for what you're yet to become. A clear mind is born when this identity is accepted, when you stop defining yourself by error and start aligning yourself with what God says about you. This is not denying the past, it is not allowing it to continue defining the present. Peter was not discarded, he was restored. And not only restored, it was repositioned. This shows that God doesn't just clear the mind, He reconstructs the identity. And when this happens, guilt loses space, shame loses strength, and the mind begins to find freedom. And it is exactly at this point that something inside you can begin to change, when the way you see yourself is no longer based on what happened and becomes based on what God has already decided about who you are. There is a type of battle that no one sees, but that defines everything. It doesn't happen in public, it doesn't make noise, but it consumes energy, generates conflict, and often makes the person feel like they're fighting against themselves. It is the internal war. Thoughts that clash, decisions that seem stuck, emotions that don't align. And the most challenging thing is that there is no way to escape from this, because this fight happens within. Jacob got to just that point. Its history was marked by strategies, escapes, attempts to control situations. But there comes a time when he can no longer run, can no longer avoid, can no longer negotiate. He needs to face it. And this battle is not against another person. It is a deep confrontation that represents everything that still needed to be transformed within him. During the night, he fights. And it's not a quick fight, it's not something simple. It is intense, prolonged, exhausting. This reveals something important. There are processes in life that are not resolved immediately. They are internal confrontations where God allows something to be broken so that something new can be built. I will not let thee go, except thou bless me. This statement shows a change. Jacob is no longer struggling to maintain control. He is struggling for transformation. He understands that leaving that experience without change was no longer an option, and that changes everything. Mind clearing often goes through this kind of process. It's not comfortable. It's not fast. It's not light. It is a confrontation with old patterns, with ways of thinking that can no longer continue. It is God exposing, adjusting, breaking down internal resistances that, for a long time, were hidden. Maybe you're living something like that right now, a moment when thoughts seem to be in conflict, where there is an internal discomfort that can no longer be ignored. And this can generate fatigue, it can generate doubt, it can even make you want to give up. But there is something important here. Not every internal struggle is a sign of defeat. It is often a sign of transformation taking place. Jacob did not leave the same way he entered. He was marked, but also transformed. His identity has been changed. This shows that when someone decides to stay in the process, something profound happens. Not just superficial, but structural. Perseverance makes all the difference. Because it's easy to give up when the process tightens, when change requires more than expected. But it is exactly at this point that the transformation is closest. And maybe what you need to understand now is that this fight is not to destroy you, it's to redefine you. It's not to weaken you, it's to align you. And when you decide not to run away, not to give up, but to stay until something changes inside you, the mind begins to be deeply cleansed, giving way to a new way of thinking, firmer, more aligned and prepared for what God is building. There is an area of spiritual life that many try to ignore, but that Jesus brought to the center of it all. It's not just what you do, it's what you think. Because before any wrong attitude, before any visible choice, something has already happened within the mind. And it is exactly there that everything begins to be defined. Jesus reveals this in a direct and profound way. Whoever looks at a woman to lust after her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. This statement breaks a superficial view of spirituality. It shows that God is not only looking at external behavior, but at what is being fed internally. This completely changes the understanding of holiness, because it's not just about avoiding actions, but about taking care of their origin, the mind. That which you allow to remain within you, that which you feed, that which you accept without question. All of this starts to shape who you are becoming. Perhaps many think that controlling actions is enough, but Jesus goes further. It shows that a disordered mind, even if apparently controlled from the outside, is still misaligned from the inside. And over time, what is inside always finds a way to manifest itself. Mind clearing, then, is not just a matter of peace, it is a matter of holiness. It is a call to a deeper level, where thoughts are also filtered, where intentions are also aligned, where what no one sees becomes a priority before God. This is not about living in guilt or pressure, but about living in conscience. About noticing when a thought is not aligned, when something starts to gain undue space, when the mind starts to move away from what is pure. And at that moment, there is a decision. Allow or reject. Feed or replace. God does not seek immediate perfection, but seeks a heart willing to align even thoughts. Because when the mind begins to be purified, something changes in all areas. Attitudes become more natural, decisions clearer, reactions more balanced. Not because of external effort, but because the root has been treated. And perhaps now you will begin to realize that the real battle is not just in what you do, but in what you allow to grow within you. Thoughts that seem small, but that carry direction. Ideas that seem fleeting, but that can become constant. When the mind becomes a place of purity, life begins to reflect this in a natural way. Because what is inside always finds a way to appear outside. And that's why God calls to this deeper level, not just right behavior, but aligned thinking. At the end of this path, there is something even stronger waiting for you. Something that not only teaches, but transforms in a real and perceptible way. Stay until the end, because what is to come can mark a new level in your spiritual life. There is a level of peace that is not born when everything is resolved, but when the mind decides to trust even without having all the answers. And this is one of the most challenging points of spiritual life, because the human mind seeks signs, guarantees, evidence that confirm that everything will work out. But God often leads differently. He calls for confidence before proof, faith before evidence, rest before confirmation. Noah lived exactly that. He was given a direction that, to any human logic, made no sense. There were no visible signs. There were no natural signs to confirm what was to come, and even so, he decided to believe. By faith, Noah. He feared, and for the salvation of his family, he prepared the ark. This reveals a mind that did not depend on what it saw, but on what God said. While everyone around probably doubted, questioned, or ignored, Noah stood firm. And that doesn't mean he didn't face contrary thoughts, but it does mean that he chose not to align himself with them. He decided to hold his mind on the word received, even when everything around seemed to say otherwise. This reveals a powerful principle of mind clearing. A clear mind is not one that has all the answers, but one that knows who it is trusting. Because when trust is established in God, the need for control begins to diminish. Anxiety loses strength. The restlessness calms down. Maybe you're in a moment where you'd like to have more signals, more clarity, more confirmations. The mind tries to understand, tries to anticipate, tries to ensure that everything will work out. But there is an invitation here to trust before you see. Rest before you fully understand. This is not passivity, it is spiritual positioning. It is deciding that God's word is enough to sustain your thoughts, even when the scenario does not cooperate. And when that decision is made, something changes profoundly. The mind begins to slow down, the weight decreases, There is a type of rest that does not depend on what is happening, but on who is driving. Noah didn't build the ark because he saw the result. He built it because he trusted the direction, and that confidence sustained his mind throughout the process. And perhaps now you realize that the peace you seek is not in the answers that have not yet come, but in the decision to trust the one who has already spoken. Because when the mind rests in God, it stops chasing certainties and begins to live sustained by a faith that does not fluctuate with time. Nothing happens without purpose. If that word has found you right now, there is something lining up within you right now. If this makes sense in your heart, write in the comments, "I believe, Lord." Sometimes a simple statement can be the beginning of a new way of thinking, lighter, firmer, and completely surrendered to God's care. Getting here was not by chance, because everything that was revealed points to a single path: to fully trust God and deliver what you tried to carry alone for so long. The mind only finds true rest when it stops resisting and begins to surrender. When he stops trying to control every detail and allows God to take the place that has always been his. There is a moment when knowledge ceases to be just something you understand and becomes something you live, and that moment is now. Because everything that has been understood so far needs to be transformed into surrender. The mind is not only cleared by what it learns, but by what it decides to deliver. As it is written in Psalm 51:10, "Create in me, O God, a clean heart, and renew in me a right spirit." This is the prayer of someone who recognizes that he needs God to transform the interior. It's not about human effort, it's about divine action. Now, in silence, prepare your heart. This is the time to place before God all that has crossed your mind, all that needs to be renewed, aligned, and restored. Let's pray together, trusting that he is present and ready to act. Beloved Father, thy word declares that thou wilt keep in perfect peace him whose mind is fixed upon thee, and it is upon this promise that we now rest, recognizing that there is no other place where our minds can find true rest than in thy presence. Lord God Almighty, at this moment we stand before you with open hearts, recognizing that we need your intervention. We thank you for every teaching revealed, for every truth that has reached us, for every moment in which the Lord has spoken directly to our interior. Thank you that your word illuminates what was confused, brings direction where there was doubt, and leads us on a path of real transformation. Father, we ask you now for strength and wisdom. Teach us to apply all that we have been given, to watch our thoughts, to align our minds with your truth. Give us discernment to reject that which is not of you, and courage to stand firm even when our own mind tries to lead us down paths of fear or doubt. Strengthen us to live according to your will, not just in words, but in thoughts, attitudes, and decisions. Lord, we present before you all the areas of our life. Those who are facing anxiety, may they now be enveloped by your peace. Those who are emotionally tired, may they find rest in you. Those who face financial struggles, opens doors and brings provision. Those who are sick, release healing and restoration. Visit each family, bringing reconciliation, love, and unity. And for those who are spiritually weak, it rekindles the flame of faith and hope. At this moment in silence, each heart opens before you. Receive, Lord, every request, every tear, every thought that needs to be transformed. Nothing is hidden before you, and we trust that you are listening to every detail. Father, we now commend everything into your hands. We surrender our worries, our fears, our repetitive thoughts, our insecurities, and everything that has occupied our mind. We declare that we no longer want to live trapped in this. We want to live guided by you. Wash our minds, purify our thoughts, and align our inner selves with your will. Where there is confusion, it establishes clarity. Where there is fear, It releases peace. Where there are accusations, he declares forgiveness. We now reject every thought that does not come from thee, and declare that our mind belongs to the Lord. It renews our way of thinking, transforms our emotions, and strengthens our spirit. May we see as you see, think as you think, and live according to your truth. We now receive the mind of Christ upon us. We declare freedom over our mental, spiritual, and emotional lives. May all anxiety, doubt, and oppression be broken by your power. Fill us with your presence, and make us people guided by your voice. We trust that your peace, which surpasses all understanding, is already guarding our minds at this moment. We remain firm, sustained by you, and declare that we will experience this transformation. In Jesus' name, amen. Getting here was not by chance. Every word, every teaching, every revelation about how God teaches to clear the mind was directed exactly to you. Because there is something that God wants to transform within you, something that goes beyond momentary emotions, something that reaches the root of your thoughts, your decisions, and the way you see your own life. The mind, which has often been a battlefield, can become a place of peace, direction, and communion with God. But this requires a decision. It is not enough to listen. It is necessary to apply. It is not enough to understand. It is necessary to live. Now the question that remains is, what are you going to do with everything that God has revealed to you today? Will you continue to entertain the same thoughts, or will you allow God to completely renew your mind? I am very happy to know that we are together on this journey, because this is not just a video, it is an encounter with God, and you are part of it. So if this message spoke to you, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell to continue receiving these words that strengthen your faith. And I want to meet you too. Right here in the comments of where you are watching, and if you feel in your heart, share a little of what you are experiencing. Your story matters, and there is a community here ready to walk in prayer with you. And pay attention to that, because what comes next might be just the next step you need. This journey does not end here. In the next video, we'll delve even deeper into how to live a life guided by God's presence and how to keep your mind steady, even in the midst of everyday battles. There is something that God still wants to show you, something that can unlock areas that you didn't even imagine. Allow God to continue speaking to your heart. Take the next step on this journey by watching the next video that will appear here on the screen. In it, we will continue to learn how to live in God's presence and experience the fullness of His plans. Don't stop here, because God still has much more to speak to you. Always remember, God is greater, and His presence is our strength. Trust Him, and He will do infinitely more than you can imagine. May God bless your life, and see you in the next video.